Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
In this episode, explore the art of scaling social innovation with AJ Tibando, co-founder and chief strategy officer at Palette Skills. In this episode, AJ navigates the journey of transforming big ideas into impactful realities. She delves into Palette's approach to tackling societal issues, employing innovative funding models, and a strategic nonprofit mindset. AJ discusses the importance of thorough research and deep customer understanding in developing sustainable and socially conscious business models. Ideal for social entrepreneurs, policymakers, and change makers, this episode offers a practical look to creating lasting change in the tech and education sectors. It's a must listen for those eager to make a difference in the world of social entrepreneurship, providing actionable insights and valuable perspectives. I am very excited to have AJ Tibando on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. AJ is the co-founder and chief strategy officer of Palette Skills. And today we're going to be talking about how to scale a social innovation. And AJ is extremely well qualified to speak on this topic, given she has scaled her nonprofit Palette Skills from an idea to a national organization with over 60 employees and an organization that's deploying hundreds of millions of dollars of capital across the country to support the reskilling space. AJ, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Can you describe at a high level, AJ, your career journey from graduating to university to launching Palette Skills?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It's been quite a journey, and it's wild to even just hear the intro of scaling social innovation and funding hundreds of millions across the country. It feels surreal, like you're talking about someone else. And I think that's when you start a social enterprise. It's a dream that you think you're going to hit one day, but not quite sure how you're going to do it. I know for me, when I started, my interest was always, not really in startups or entrepreneurship. I was really driven by systems and power and politics and sort of social policy. And so I went to school for political science. That was my starting point. And I always knew that I was really interested in sort of change making and solving big problems. I did a master's in political science as well. And when I graduated, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to be sort of politics adjacent and was really looking more into the advocacy world. But an opportunity came up to start to take a job in politics at the provincial government here in Ontario as a political aide, and I jumped on it. And so I spent the next 6 years taking on various roles and responsibilities in government on the political side of the world. Worked on post-secondary issues, retraining issues, economic development, innovation, and as well as a number of social policy issues. And I did that job throughout. I started my first job the day Lehman Brothers collapsed. So I was there for the Great Recession and really kind of saw the world of government and politics through the lens of what happens when the economy starts to collapse, and really saw that I'm a big believer in the power of government to do big things, but I really saw some of the limits to what kinds of problems it could solve and what kinds of problems it was really well suited to solve. I don't think government is designed to solve every social problem that we have. And so I saw the need and opportunity for outside forces to also be jumping in and trying to solve these problems as well. And so I got really interested in the idea of entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship. This was right around the time when, Facebook was just taking off, Twitter was just taking off. This was like the early 2010s. And I thought, it would be really interesting to see if you could take some of those innovation approaches that we were seeing and hearing about in tech and apply them to social challenges in the world. And so that was when I was ready to leave my work in politics and government, I decided to jump into the world of entrepreneurship and I started a company before Palette called Sojo. It was really designed to work with students and young people who are interested in entrepreneurship and teach them the tools of social entrepreneurship, how to apply an entrepreneurial toolkit to big, complicated social challenges. And did that for a number of years, and then moved on to start Palette. And here we are. That was almost 7 years ago. So, yeah.
How did your journey of creating and founding Sojo help prepare you for building and scaling Palette?
Yeah, there would be no Palette without Sojo for me. Absolutely, it was the gateway for me into this whole other world of problem solving, and it was the jumping in to try to build something when you have just an idea, and going through that experience of figuring out how to breathe life into an idea and get other people excited by your idea and buy into it and inevitably pay you for it. um, that's a whole it's a really unique experience. It's a really challenging experience, and I think it's one that is hard to fathom until you just jump in and do it. Um, and it's very, yeah, like I said, it's very challenging. And so I think that was that. But once you do it, you realize there's a method to how you start things. There's a process that you can work through. There's a system that you can work through to validate ideas and test them and bring in customers. And so the more I understood the process of how to take an idea and test it and validate it and breathe life into it, the more you become confident in your ability to do that in the future. And so with Sojo, we were teaching people. We had sort of built the toolkit ourselves to figure out how to create a social enterprise, because at the time, the way that we wanted to do it in sort of the same vein as all these innovative startups and tech companies that we saw, there wasn't a lot of people talking about that. And so we kind of built our own toolkit and then started explaining how to do it to other people. And so by the time I left Sojo, I felt like I really understood how to put the pieces of an idea together in a way that could rapidly, assuming the idea is a good one, and gains traction. I felt like I had the understanding of how to take an idea through that rapid scale process, and was really excited at the idea of being able to take Palette through that.
And for context of to our listeners, AJ and I actually met probably 8 or 9 years ago at this
Yeah.
point, when
Yeah.
she was working still full time on Sojo. So we've known each other for many years, and it's been awesome to see the journey. To kind of go into a little bit more detail on Palette, how did you kind of come up with the idea? What was the sort of genesis of the organization?
Yeah. So the idea kind of came from a lot of different places, and it all sort of, as good ideas to do, lots of pieces came together from lots of places and formed into what we had. For me, um, as I said, I spent a lot of time when I was in government working on employment issues, dealing with people who were dealing with mass layoffs and trying to figure out what to do with their careers. During the recession, what was really unique about the 2008 recession that you could really feel when it was happening was that there were big structural changes happening in the economy. It wasn't just a matter of, there's a dip in demand and there's some contraction and then everything will kind of go back to normal once demand goes back up. It was like technology is changing things. There are changes to the way that we use technology that is going to change the way we do our jobs in the future. And so this sort of sense that there were big changes coming to the labor market. And from the viewpoint that I had when I was in government, I did not think that, government alone was going to be able to address all of the challenges that would result from it. So there's a lot of interest in the idea of coming up with a better way to help people meet their potential, help them get caught when they lose their jobs, and have a pathway to not just going back to an increasingly precarious role, but actually transition to a high growth, high demand role in the economy. So that was a real kind of a guiding force for me in being passionate about pursuing this idea. There were other folks, at the table, other co-founders when this idea was getting started too, that were coming from it from other angles as well, around being more on the industry side of things and seeing, that oftentimes a lot of the training programs that existed were overtraining people, taking too long for what industry needed, and giving people almost too many, more skills than industry needed, which was inefficient when the goal on both sides was someone wanted a job as quickly as possible, and a company wanted to fill a role as quickly as possible. And so, yeah, finding that, creating more efficiency in the system, creating better connection between supply and demand, helping change the way employers view talent and what good looks like, and who can do jobs. These were all real guiding motivations for sure when Palette started out.
What were the initial first, let's say, 2 years of Palette like? Can you walk us through that journey?
Yeah. So, uh, well, so I worked with a co-founder named Arvind Gupta in the early days of Palette. And so the very beginning of the Palette journey actually started really when I was on maternity leave with my daughter, who just turned 7. So that's how I always plot how long I've been doing this for. Um, was we reconnected? We knew each other from a long time ago, and started talking about this idea, both kind of bringing different angles at it, and so, it just started with with conversations, and then with a whiteboard, and then typing up what goes on that whiteboard into a pitch deck, and shopping it around. And so that was, like anything starts, that's how this started. When I and at first, it wasn't clear whether there was anything here worth building. But it became clear as I had more conversations, that there was real opportunity to build something exciting here. And so when I was ready to go back to work, after my mat leave, I knew that this was something I wanted to really commit to trying to build, and that at the end of the day, if we were going to make this thing a reality, somebody had to be, like any startup, you can have a whole bunch of ideas, but someone's got to decide to commit to making the thing happen, right? Someone's got to decide to be, when the only thing powering you is your human energy, someone's got to be the human to build the momentum. And so I was ready to do that. But I had bootstrapped Sojo, and I knew how painful that experience was, and I wasn't interested in doing it again. And I knew that for the, having watched the investment environment in for-profit enterprises, having seen, how long it takes to understand, the complexity of social challenges, and to build real solutions to them, not just sort of surface level solutions that often, because you want to start and build something really quickly with a startup, you end up kind of deviating towards what's the simplest thing we could build or do to solve this problem. And oftentimes, in my experience, they don't necessarily get to the root cause of the real systems change that you're trying to create. And so I was ready to jump into committing to this full time, but I knew I needed a lot of runway to really do the research and validate the real problem that was causing this, because we had 20 years of track record of government policies and other policies that hadn't addressed this challenge or solved this challenge, right? So I approached the Brookfield Institute. It was now, they've now changed their name to the DAIS, but they're based out of Toronto Metropolitan University, and they do a lot of research into, excuse me, exactly these kinds of issues around automation and technology in the workforce and skills, and just the changing need of the economy as it evolves in its makeup. And they had just published a report called The Talented Mr. Robot, which was all about the impacts of automation on the workforce and how it was going to change the jobs we needed. And so I approached them and said, you guys are trying to solve this problem from a research angle. We have an idea to solve it from an action angle. But we need more time to figure out whether there's an idea here worth pursuing and to do some research. And they agreed to hire me on for a year to essentially support my salary while I built out the business case for Palette and did the research for it. And I published a number of reports through the Brookfield Institute based on what I found during that period. And that work ultimately led to the proposal that we submitted to the government that resulted in our first round of pilot funding to launch our first pilot and then launch the company, really.
That's a really creative way to get that initial funding off the ground. And I actually can relate a lot to Venture for Canada. In the first year of the organization, we entered into an arrangement with an agency of the government of Ontario where they didn't have like funding that they could provide us, but they could hire my colleague as an employee and second him to work 100% on Venture for Canada.
Yep.
And they did that for like 3 years, and we're also housed in their office space. So it's actually kind of funny. Like I wasn't fully aware of that background in terms of how Palette that initial kind of funding came.
Yeah.
And it's interesting the kind of parallels. And I actually think it's a good takeaway for like different aspiring like nonprofit entrepreneurs to think about, right? Like, yes, there's like different funding pots that you can apply for, but also to like kind of get creative and think about how can you incubate your social innovation within a much kind of like larger organization, in particular potentially through being like an initial like an employee seconded to like work on a specific project.
Yeah, I think it's like this podcast is all about scaling social enterprise and social innovation, and I think this is a huge component of it that that we really need to figure out, and I don't even know who we is when I say we, but there needs to be a better way or a clearer way to do this because, good social innovation requires a really deep understanding of the problem. Like before and anytime you're building, like they know this in technology, right? Like if you're building an innovative product, your first goal should not be to come up with a cool product idea. Your first goal should be to spend time to understand your customer's problem and their pain point so well you understand it almost better than they do, right? Like to get so deep inside your customer's mind and what keeps them up at night, what are their business challenges, how is that affecting other parts of their business? And in tech, that's what you do. You spend 99% of your time, especially in that early period, just really understanding the problem because it's often more complicated and more simple than you think it is, right? And that's how, when you build, if you see these really great tech products that come out that seem to like just have perfect product market fit to like zeroing in on an issue for a customer and they just gain traction instantly because it's like, where have you been all my life? They don't do that because the founder woke up one day and knew like, this is the product we need to build. They did that because they probably put a year, if not years of market research into deeply understanding their market before they launch their product. And so that is the number one, to me, metric of success or indicator of success that you're going to be able to launch something that works is if you can have the time to really just focus on the problem way before you start even thinking about a solution. But the way that, and so knowing that tech has ultimately, in a lot of ways figured this out, when you look at the investments that come through for them, a lot of times that first round is, they're angels, right? They're not expecting a big return on investment immediately. They know they're paying for you to go just do the work, do the research. They're probably just paying for a salary. They're looking to understand what you learned about the problem more than, how many customers did you book for the solution. But that's because that's how things start. And I haven't seen, in my experience, I don't know how you follow that similar path. There's not a lot of angel investors in the social enterprise space. I would argue, to me, Brookfield was our angel investor because they were willing to take a risk on me, take a risk on an idea, but just invest in the time to get it right, um, and it's a risky investment. And for them, it worked because they knew that whatever was going to happen in that period of time, I was going to learn something and I could publish it for them. And they're in the business of learning new things and publishing them. Right. So there was a really nice fit there. But I think that is such a vital period. And so often when you look at the funding pots that are available in different funding agencies, it starts, the smallest thing you can fund is a pilot, right? But a pilot is a solution. A pilot is not research into a problem. A pilot's a solution. So if your first round of funding that you go after as an innovator is pilot funding, you're still being forced to kind of skip ahead or skip over a really important step. And it's like, well, you can learn from your market by running a pilot. It's like, yes, but you are already making a whole series of choices in launching that pilot that aren't necessarily going to be informed by your market initially. And then you're going to go down a path that you're going to have some sunk costs into a solution that may or may not work. And then you're going to finish your pilot, say, you know what, this didn't work. So funder, go fund me for a completely different pilot because I failed this one because we picked the wrong solution up front. Like, no, you're going to try and make that look as successful as possible to get your next. So it just like, when you start there, you just are taken down this path of find the easiest, lowest risk thing that we can do to make this pilot successful. And let's do that on the timelines that we've been given, when really it should be, let's really understand this problem. Once we fully understand this problem, let's start playing with some ideas of what a solution could look like before we even know what to build, test them, iterate, talk to our customers again. And then once we know, okay, this is worth building, then go find that pilot money and start building it.
There are three different things that kind of come to mind from what you were saying. The first is around the Map the System competition, which is run through the School Center at Oxford. And I think it's like a great challenge that exists in terms of fostering certain skills in students. Essentially, what the challenge does is it invites students to map the system of the problem rather than to pitch like a business solution. So basically, people do this whole like mapping the system of like a problem, and then they present the map to like a series of judges.
Yeah.
But I think it's a great example of like how do we shift a little bit from like a real focus on what is solution to the X problem to more like what is the problem itself, and then in that journey of understanding the problem, then solutions kind of come afterwards. The second thing that came to mind was this book someone recommended to me a while ago called like The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which basically talks about, in essence, like the way that a lot of funding kind of works is it's very challenging to often do revolutionary things within the nonprofit sector because there's such a focus on just delivery and there's not often that much funding for like there can be funding for pilots, but there's often not funding for research. Or sometimes when there's funding for research, it's like very academic and it's not necessarily like research of like user, like speaking directly to customers. So that was the second point. The third one is just to relate to some things we're thinking about at VFC. It's like, for instance, like there's a new program concept that we're thinking of potentially launching. And I've just been having probably over the last 3 or 4 months, a ton of different conversations with people in this very specific space, just to learn a little bit more, understand the players, understand the market gaps. But all of that work is not like funded by any, like it's just something I'm doing off the side of my desk. And then as we launch there's another pilot that we have received funding for that we will be launching next year. But even to ensure that like as part of that, like we build in like it's like research/pilot. And often you have to kind of push a little hard to be like, okay, there needs to be like at least like a 6-month research phase. Ideally, it should be like longer than that. But it can be a lot of funders aren't necessarily set up to support that kind of research. And there's a pressure just to immediately start delivering outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. I mean, that was it. Our early days, even when we got our pilot funding, it was like, we kind of knew the problem we wanted to solve, but we still like, were like, we need time to actually really research and test and validate that this is good. And I get it. These are burning problems, and oftentimes, particularly if you're dealing with government. I mean, if you're dealing with nonprofit funding, odds are you're either dealing with government or you're dealing with an entity funded by government, right? And so they carry a lot of pressure to have good reporting outcomes and really tangible reporting outcomes, right? Like it all needs to ladder up to press releases that talk about how many people got jobs or how many people got trained or how many businesses succeeded. But that's what they're looking for. And I get it. I worked in those worlds for many years. So I completely understand the pressure on the other side. I think, I think this is a space where there could be interesting opportunities for other players to get more involved in supporting this kind of work, because I don't know, like it's one of those funny things. I sit here as an entrepreneur saying, like, entrepreneurs need time to research, they need time to validate, they need runway. As a taxpayer, I don't know how much runway I want to be throwing out willy-nilly at every entrepreneur who's interested in solving a problem, right? So, I respect that it's a balance, and that for government or those who are funded through government to fund, there's a lot of logical reasons why they need to keep things tight and keep the deliverables tangible. But so then it's like, okay, well, who else is out there, that could be interesting in this space and could be doing things. I do think that the work that Brookfield did with us and their willingness to take that chance could be a model for other research institutes or policy institutes that are doing all this great research, and they're sitting there thinking, how do we breathe life into this, right? Like, we've got all these great insights, we spend all this time building these reports, and then we put them out into the world, and people read them at first, and then what happens? But these ideas are good, and they're solid, and they're enduring, and a lot of those institutes are interested in doing more research and learning new things. And so there's, I think, an alignment there with a lot of the proactive social entrepreneurs looking for the right space to get started in, but some time to do it right. And anyway, I think that would be a really interesting thing to see some enterprising institutes step up into, as being, I don't even know if you want to be an incubator, just maybe just aim to be an angel, right? And don't make it more complicated than that. You don't need to figure out how to spin these things into anything beyond what they are. But that runway and that opportunity for runway is just so key. It's so key, especially when you're trying to actually change a system, and not just build a product.
It's interesting. I've had a few conversations with people lately on this broader topic of like the lack of like almost incubation services for like nonprofits or charities. Like there's hundreds of like for-profit like incubators and accelerators across Canada. I can think of a small handful, like the Leap Center, but that's even for like much more established, like it would be more organizations of our size. There's very few that are around like, okay, how do you actually like launch like an early stage like kind of nonprofit and kind of get it off the ground? And there's a lot of intricacies, like how do you build a board, like nonprofit versus charity, and all of these other things. And there's a gap.
This was the gap we invented Sojo to try and fill. We just needed the market to realize it was a gap, and we couldn't find one that cared enough to pay us to fill it. But I agree completely. There's a real lack, and I spent a lot of time in a lot of different incubators, like more, I don't even want to say traditional, but tech focused, for profit startup incubators. So that is really what exists, and they're great spaces. I think this is the thing that I would hate to see is an entirely sort of separate wing of startup services for social enterprises spring up independent of the existing incubation system, because I think that one of the things that has made me successful and Palette successful as a social enterprise is that we have always thought of ourselves as a business. Like, we're nonprofit, we're not profit motivated, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what your motive is, whether it's making money or making change. If you are not creating value for a customer, you're not going to get traction with your product. You're not going to get product market fit, and the impact that you're trying to accomplish isn't going to get realized. And so, the training that I got while I was in these business focused incubators and I'm coming from a policy world, a policy background. And so this was all pretty foreign to me. This sort of just laser focus on customer, understanding your customer discovery, product market fit. Like, these are, nothing else matters until you achieve those things. And that level of focus, especially in the early stages when you have just an endless number of things you could be focusing on, the training to really focus on that and get clear on that to make sure that you're building a product that is going to gain traction was the game changer for us in a big way. And so I think it's an interesting balance. You need to, but at the same time, a lot of those incubation spaces that are business focused are for profit focused and make the assumption everybody is profit motivated and define success on profit seeking behavior. So great, you have an idea. So how, who's going to pay for it? How are you going to make money? Well, we're going to apply for grants. And it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And so it was being there was a great experience in that it really stretched me in my understanding of how to start things, how to build a business, how to stay focused on what matters, especially in those early stages. But it was also really uncomfortable in a less productive way because there was no recognition of any other way of, why would you be doing this if it's not to 10x your investment and make a ton of money, right? And so I think it's finding those spaces that aren't, that are inclusive for people who are not there because they want to sort of exploit or extract, but are still, really sort of tough and firm on building high value products. Because at the end of the day, whatever system you're trying to change, your system is made up of a collection of people. Those people have problems, and whatever you're trying to convince them to do has to solve a problem they care about, or they're not going to do it. And if you can't get down to that level to convince one person to adopt your product or change their model or do whatever you're trying to do, then you're not going to be able to do it at a systems level either.
At Venture for Canada, sometimes we'll use the term nonprofit impact, startup culture, and it's to try to merge the two together in kind of an interesting way, which it sounds like I think you're doing same. It's interesting to think about incubators or accelerators potentially having nonprofit streams, because I agree. I think that there's a benefit to that co-location, but there are also a lot of unique challenges that nonprofits have. The funding models are different. There's a lot of nonprofit boards are different than for-profit boards. And there's a lot of other intricacies specific to nonprofits that I think having some dedicated training would be helpful. But to your point that there's also probably the majority of the content would overlap with what I think a for-profit startup would receive.
Yeah, totally. There's definitely a gap. There's definitely a missing space right now for people who want to build high impact, scalable social innovations. 100%.
And I feel like over the years, there's just probably every couple months, there's some random person who I get connected with who's starting an early stage nonprofit, and it's some friend of a friend, and they're like, "Hey, you should chat just around." And you probably, based on your nodding, I feel like you can relate to this. And I think I end up having all these conversations partially because there's so much hidden knowledge of how do you actually build a nonprofit or charity. One can read books on it, but a lot of it I found has been learned through vicarious lived experience. So I'm not sure if you relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I remember when I was in my early stages of starting being like, who can I talk to? Right. Like struggling to be like, who's done this before and who understands what we're doing here and what's the what's the path to replicate. And now that I'm where I am at 100%, I'm contacted all the time. And I'm always excited and happy to talk to people about it because I know what it's like to be at the beginning of something and be like, you know, I think I can do this, but I don't know what I'm doing. So I'd love to talk to someone. So yeah, no, people talk all the time, reach out all the time. And I think it is it's a hidden network that we need to find a way to make more visible because, I think it shouldn't be that hard to pursue ideas that can have a positive impact. And I think also people shouldn't be left to assume that um, there's only one way to start a business.
Yeah, great. For a lot of people, like depending on the business model, a nonprofit or charity makes way more sense than doing like a for-profit model, and often getting the right legal incorporation status, like nonprofit or for-profit,
Yeah.
can be a game changing on whether the organization is successful or not.
Yeah. Well, so I'll tell you a story about like why we're a nonprofit because when we so Sojo was a for profit. Now we started as a nonprofit, we became a for profit, but part of that was really intentionally wanting to see if we could drive a social innovation, product and business through a nonprofit model, right? Like, is there space for um, putting impact first in this kind of a business model and knowing literally nothing about business and models and things like that. And so that was kind of the experiment, one of the meta experiments we were doing when we were starting Sojo was just sort of understanding what that for-profit environment was like and what it asked of you and what it required and how it all worked and the expectations. And we saw pretty quickly that it was really, really challenging to run a for-profit through or run the social impact objective and mission through a for-profit business. And a big part of that was due to the investment environment around it. We definitely did not have friends and family or rich uncles or anything like that who could throw money at our pipe dreams. And so we started because we were in an incubator and this was just sort of the cycle that you get into. We started pitching investors and trying to get some seed funding and do all these things. And we could not for the life of us find anyone who was interested in, as soon as you started talking about bigger change or social impact or any of that stuff, it was like repellent for a lot of investors because they saw it as risk. And I understand the logic behind it because you're taking your money, you're giving it to me, and my job to you is to increase your money, right? Like that's the relationship with an investor. You're giving me your money. I got to go build something successful. The end result is your money gets bigger and you get some of it back at the end. And so it's like, if I'm going to focus on literally anything other than making you money, I'm a risky bet for you, right? Relative to the guy next to me who's only cares about making money. And so it was just really, really challenging unless someone kind of knew you personally. Uh, it was extremely challenging to raise any kind of money in that environment. And then, it was interesting because I was at a pod where I sat in this incubator with a whole bunch of other there was like a handful of us motley crew social enterprise people, and all of us were about the same stage and going after investment, and some of them had different products that were a little more attractive to investors, and so some of them were successful in securing seed funding, and like clockwork within 6 months of signing their term sheets and closing their rounds. They were pivoting their business away from whatever their impact objectives were into just straight sort of revenue gen profit making play. And it was because their investors, gave them a little bit of time for whatever reason. And they were like, okay, we're going to invest in your product. We're not so sure about this impact thing, but we think there's opportunity here in the product. So you've got some time. Go prove to us that you can do X, Y, and Z by this deadline. And then they couldn't, and it was probably unrealistic to expect them to be able to do that by that deadline. But either way, the net result was they dropped like flies when it came to their impact goals. And so when I was sitting in Brookfield in that, day one, being like, okay, I guess, we're doing this, and sooner or later, we're going to have to incorporate into something. There was a real active conversation about whether this is a for-profit or a nonprofit, because you could imagine a for-profit play here, right? Talent is recruiters exist, right? Companies pay for talent. You could imagine that there is an opportunity to follow that model. And there was a lot of debate and discussion amongst a whole group of folks that were at the table with me around what was the best path. But ultimately, we knew we needed runway. I knew we needed runway. I knew we needed a lot more time than a private investor would allow us to take to get off the ground. And I knew we needed to really be able to test and validate and learn from what we were doing at our own pace, so that we could actually get deep into what this systemic challenge was. And so when we looked at, we didn't make a decision about our corporate structure because of, what felt better. We looked at how are we going to fund this thing, and what group of funders are most aligned to our mission and how we want to grow this organization. And when we looked at it from that perspective, it was clear that government was really the primary funder for us for what we were trying to do, and that it would be a lot easier for them to fund us if we were a nonprofit. We also knew that the model we wanted to pursue would be heavily partnered with post-secondary institutions and other nonprofits and other organizations, and to get them to trust us and to work with us at the depth and level that we wanted to work with them, being a nonprofit would be an important part of that relationship as well. So it was a strategic and intentional decision to become a nonprofit after looking at both options very carefully. But it was inevitably about the investment environment and what was best aligned to a mission-oriented organization that wanted to scale itself really dramatically at a systems level in a short period of time.
Yeah, it's interesting to your point about the for-profit versus nonprofit kind of option, and it's particularly in your space of reskilling, and also potentially a little bit in our space of VFC. Like, there's companies like in the UK, multiverse.io, that does like apprenticeship, and to your like, you're probably familiar with them, yeah, they're for-profit model, but then they're because of they're venture backed, and they're, I think, funded by like the Walton family, like some very wealthy backers, but because of some of the venture pressure, that there can be ethical critiques of that model, because there's how can we get as many butts through the door? How can we train as many people? How do we increase the revenue models? And there's a lot of benefit. I mean, to say nonprofit sector can still have its challenges, but I think that when you remove that pressure, you can focus a little bit more on the impact rather than just the bottom line of the organization.
Absolutely. I think, we see it all the time in our everyday lives and the products that we use. You can feel when an app goes public, because the quality of user experience drops precipitously, because their focus becomes on ad revenue and usage rates and all these different things, as opposed to user experience and growth and traction. The distraction of profit generation from value creation is really not talked about as much as it should be, given, I think, we're at a state in our economy where we're wondering why nothing seems to work anymore, and nothing we try seems to get the results that we're looking for. We're trying to create value in an environment that is really values profit extraction, and that is a huge distraction when it comes to how are we just solving problems in a way that is going to create enduring solutions. I would love to see how many hands would go up in a room full of tech entrepreneurs, if you ask them, would you have made different product design decisions if you didn't have to think about your shareholders, right? How would your products be different today if you didn't have to think about hitting your profit targets for this quarter, or last quarter or the quarter before? How might your business be different today if you didn't have to think about that? And to be clear, profit, I think one of the big misconceptions around a nonprofit is that you can't generate more money than you spend to build something, right? And you can, in fact, generate more money in a nonprofit than it takes to build something. You just can't extract that money out of your business and give it to someone who wasn't part of building that thing. You have to keep it in your business and you have to reinvest it and grow it. And, there are some rules around how you do some of that stuff, but overall, this idea that you can't grow or you can't, you can't run a business in a nonprofit isn't true. It's that you just can't extract that money out of the business and privatize it, right? It has to stay public, or it has to stay creating value for the people you're trying to create value for, right? That's ultimately what it means. And yet we have this idea that, if you want to grow something big, it's got to be a for-profit. And if you want to do good, it's got to be a nonprofit. And I think that there's a huge misconceptions on both sides of that. And at the end of the day, the distraction of having to satisfy your shareholders when they're not your customers, they're not your employees, they're not the people who are creating the value for here. Like it can be a really big distraction.
And there can be huge organizations that have alternative models, like the co-op movement. Desjardins, huge financial institution, and it's a co-op.
Yeah.
And I think the largest financial institution in Quebec, and I think it's like the second largest co-op in like the world. But they're a great example of a role model to look at. One thing to kind of close the loop a little bit on the journey with Palette. You described the first kind of 2 years of the organization. Can you describe the kind of next like 5 years, and what was your journey like, AJ, from that kind of 2-year period to where you are today?
Yeah. I mean, it's been a wild ride, to say the least. That initial 2-year period was a lot of that research and testing. And I should say, like, research like this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Like, you're out there, it's talking to people, it's listening to them, it's writing down, based on what I'm hearing, here's what I think you need, and taking it back to them and validating it, right? So it's these iterative conversations, but it ends in a product, like a product design, at least, that you want to build. And so when we had that, we got our first round of funding. It came through ESDC. It was $1 million to launch our first pilot, which was for our Sales Camp program. And Sales Camp has now become our sort of flagship training program or upskilling program that we run. And it was to prove that we could take workers from one industry and upskill them very quickly and move them into another industry. And so we picked tech and the role of sales jobs within tech, because we had heard a lot of demand from the tech companies that we were working with. And we targeted workers coming out of retail and hospitality, because at the time there was a lot of disruption in those spaces. Sears had just shut down, HomeSense was shutting down, there was a whole bunch of layoffs there. So thought it would be really cool to do that transition. So that was our first round of funding, and our first pilot that allowed us to hire staff. So I think we, including myself, hired 3 people at that point. Less than a year later, we raised our next round of funding, which was $5 million through FedDev, which is the economic development agency here in Ontario. And that was to run 2 additional pilots as well. So we staffed up a little bit more from that. And that was multi-year funding. So that gave us also a little bit of stability in terms of our timelines. And then the pandemic hit and things got really blurry. I think we were 5 people when we went into lockdown. we became a virtual organization at that point. We pivoted all of our programs to be virtually delivered. And we really focused on continuing to grow Sales Camp. We launched our cybersecurity program to test. We were really looking to, we weren't looking to build an organization that was just operating programs. We were looking to build an organization that created a better model for how to transition people from one part of the labor market to another. And to do it in a way that industry trusted and was excited and really responded to their need for talent and new talent pipelines into their sectors. And so every time we ran these pilots, we had our pilot, like our program objectives we needed to meet, but what we were really trying to do is learn learn what we were doing right, learn what we were doing wrong, and isolate, a series of principles or a model that we could systematize across the country. And so, so the next couple of years were really just right around that. It was around piloting these models, learning what was working, testing, changing, and all the while really communicating clearly with government at the both federal and provincial levels what we were learning, what we were seeing, what was working, and advocating for the need to fund this kind of work at scale across the country. And then in 2022, my years are all mixed up. I think it was 2021 budget, the government announced the Upskilling for Industry initiative. And then it was the following year that they put out the call for proposals. And that was the $250 million upskilling fund that they launched and that we ultimately became the successful recipient of, that has allowed us to scale our model across the country. And so in those, in those 5 years between, just launching ourselves as an entity and scaling, it was really focused on piloting, refining, proving ourselves, and preparing to ultimately take off.
It's been so exciting to watch the journey of Palette over the last 7 years, and excited to see the impact that you folks will continue to create. Do you have any closing thoughts, suggestions for folks on how to scale social innovations?
I think the first step to scaling is starting. So I would encourage you, if you're thinking about doing something, get started. I think that, as you've heard from my story, you always have options. You always have a path forward, but it's often not going to look the way you think it'll look or the way it looks for other people, because what you're trying to do is different. But be creative and don't be afraid to ask for what you want. I'll tell you, I just woke up one morning. I had a meeting booked with the Brookfield Institute. I had been kind of laying awake all night, just thinking, I want to do this palette thing. I want to turn it into a thing. How am I going to make it happen? And I woke up that morning and I thought, I'm just going to ask them. And I walked into that meeting. We had a great meeting about what we were doing, and and they were really excited, and they were sort of like, the meeting was ending the way all meetings end, which was like, well, we'd love to help you out. If there's ever anything we can do, let us know. And I thought, hire me. And and I just threw it out there, and it's scary. Like, you put stuff out there, you don't know if you're going to get a yes back or if you're going to get laughed out of a room. And there was a very high risk of the second. But if I hadn't just asked and I hadn't just gone for it, like, this series of events wouldn't have happened. So I think, overall, whether you're scaling, whether you're starting, no matter where you are in the journey, just, you see an opportunity, take it, jump at it. Don't be afraid to ask. And somebody's going to say yes. So
there's an old adage from fundraisers that goes along the lines of, the main reason people don't give is they're not asked. And I think that relates to what you're saying. So I think that, to some extent, just do it and dive in and see what people say. AJ, it's been such a pleasure catching up with you today in general. I've so enjoyed getting to know you over close to a decade. And thanks so much. I think that you did an awesome job talking about how to scale social innovation. And I think that the context of like your lived experience building Palette Skills is a great illustrative example of like what it takes and what are the steps involved in building like a large national nonprofit. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.